Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, we're going to be looking at the Indianapolis as well as the Buenos Aires results. Two tournaments over the weekend, both in our standard formats. The Indianapolis regional was massive, it was over 2,000 players. Over in the special event, it was just over 160 players, but still relevant and some interesting deck lists in that top 8 as well. Before we get into the actual deck list breakdown, because there are a lot of interesting results going on here, we're going to start off with the day 1 and 2 breakdown that we have for Indianapolis, where Charizard was by far and away the most popular deck in day 1. I feel like that's going to be a continuing story. Possibly we've hit that peak now because we see in the top 8 it was quite a volatile field for Charizard, and even though it had a good day 1 to day 2 conversion, it kind of struggled getting to the very end of the tournament where there was just one too many awkward matchups or 50-50 matchups at best in and around it, and it feels like we're still figuring out what those decks are. I do still expect Charizard to be very, very popular and certainly the most popular deck going into the next couple of tournaments, but we have started to see some decks that can try and at least have a decent chance into it now. Not necessarily dethroning Charizard, but certainly holding their own against the archetype. And I think chien-pao does embody that quite well. It was the second most popular deck in the day 1 field. For those people sort of respecting Charizard but not wanting to play mirror matches, I think this is a decent fallback play. Just has decent matchup into that Zard. And as we know, if you can just learn the sequencing of chien-pao quite well, you can certainly go far in the tournament. It does have that power to carry you through. And I think we saw that with a number of very strong players choosing to jump to the chien-pao. Then we have the two different Giratina variants. There's the Lost Zone build as well as the Arc Giratina builds. I think these also hold their own quite nicely into Charizard. I think the upside of the Arc Tina is that it's a slightly better time into chien-pao. Neither of them actually love chien-pao. The Lost Zone engine struggles with, early Greninja shenanigans and this, that, and the other. You don't have those same disruption plays that you used to with Path of the Peak gone. And the Arc build obviously can get blown up turn by turn, but you are at the very least throwing Judge at them early on before they can establish their candy combo, before they can establish their big barrel engine. Sometimes from that you can just sort of gain the tempo, even though chien-pao can be easily scoring 2 prizes back on you every single turn. The fact that you are going to be counter-capturing, bossing up their engine pieces throughout the game and looking to get like very late game Ionos to have a bit of breathing room, I think that matchup is pretty reasonable from my own experience, and of course Eerie can be helpful, so that's kind of the main trade-off, both of them trying to have a decent time into Charizard at the very least. Then we have Ancient Box obviously doing well the previous tournaments, no surprise there that it was still fairly popular, and Lugia Archeops still also making it into that day 1 graphic. Also has a respectable time into Charizard, has that one-hit KO potential in the form of a single prize Pokemon, which can be a big deal, and is still pretty versatile at dealing with the other decks in format. Itself is its own worst enemy really, rather than the matchups around it. Then jumping into the day 2 analysis, there's actually something pretty interesting that I'll show in Limitless, is that actually, I don't know why, but Lost Zone Box wasn't correctly registered, I guess, or whatever, on Arcanine, or at least put onto the graphic properly. But Lost Zone Box should be sandwiched between Arctina and Gardevoir here. Actually, the same number of Arctina was Lost Zone Box's conversion. Again, because I think it was put in weirdly in Arcanine, or they just weren't being registered properly, or they were put into the sort of other decks category because they're so versatile in their attacking options, where it's all just like one-of attackers at this point, that it wasn't getting registered properly. And I think you can see by the fact that there's that sort of 35% other decks, I think, 40% in day 1 are that other decks category. It wouldn't surprise me if Lost Zone Box was like 8 or 10% possibly the day 1 field. It just wasn't accurately put into the data. So I don't think this is the case where Lost Zone Box was storming the event by having an exceptional day 1 to day 2 performance and it just wasn't registered. I think it's an Arcanine issue more than anything else, but you can see in Limitless, based on the amount of players making it into day 2 with Lost Zone Box, that it still is a pretty decent contender. So bear that in mind. That's something the graphic doesn't show you, but it's something you can ascertain based on the Limitless data. But the sort of overarching story is that Charizard, despite being that popular day one is still capable of taking on everything, including winning those mirrors, and still has a positive day one to day two conversion. So it is still a fantastic points deck. There's no doubt about that. Still one of the higher consistency decks that we see on this graphic, certainly, and the day one graphic as well. So yeah, still a fantastic play. All the sort of hate for Charizard is out there, and you still have counterplay into them and hand disruption and all this other stuff. So I wouldn't be put off Charizard, even with the insane results of top 8 that we saw recently. If you just want to accumulate points, Charizard is still a really good deck for that. chien-pao maintaining its stance pretty nicely. The Arc build of Giratina has outperformed the Lost Zone build of Giratina very slightly. Obviously, there's like a big skill gap between the two decks. I think it's much easier to pilot Arc Tina to a day 2 finish than regular Lost Tina to a day 2 finish. That might be somewhat of the reason why it's doing better, or slightly just better placement in general. I'm personally, you know, Arc Tina is the deck that I took to EUIC, so I'm a little bit biased towards this one. I feel like it's got a very even and safe matchup spread across the board. Then we have Gardevoir, which I don't think was on that day 1 graphic, so that's the deck that really did climb quite nicely, whereas Lugia was just kind of holding on. Lost Tina lost a little bit of ground, as did the Ancient Box, which lost a little bit of ground. Gardevoir is certainly an interesting one. It has that uptrade potential with one prize Pokemon, and actually thanks to things like Screamtail, it can be disruptive into chien-pao. Obviously, chien-pao has a decent number of ways to take multi-prize turns into the matchup, where they can use Iron Hand, use Greninja, this, that, and the other. But if Gardevoir can like stabilize and still take out engine pieces whilst using Iono and whatnot, I feel like you're actually like in that game quite nicely. I think Gardevoir is very favoured into Arc Tina, pretty favoured into Lugia, and can hold its own into Charizard as well, especially with the focus not really being on Gardevoir. You can't really fit more than one vacuum in like any deck, and a number of them won't play one at all. So Gardevoir is just kind of like flying under this radar as certainly a good draw engine deck with powerful uptrade potential, but no one can really commit space to like dealing with it, I suppose. So I think it's in a pretty good spot as well right now for another like safe points play, and I think that day 1 to day 2, where it had a pretty nice uptick, is a good showing of that. Then we jump into the top 8 decks and players, where half of the top cuts was chien-pao. I don't think many people expected this, although when you're looking at the pilots, where we have Grant Shen, Nick Moffat, Andrew Mahone, and Eddie North all piloting this archetype, they're all well-respected, known players. Grant's been playing this archetype for a bunch of time. I know Mahone's been playing this on stream a bunch. Nicholas, he's just such a high-standard player and can really turn his arm at anything and have a great pilot behind whatever deck he picks up. So chien-pao, definitely like a skill-expressive deck where you're trying to get that sequencing correct. If you get in the groove of chien-pao, you can reap those rewards, and I think we're seeing that with these players here. One of the other ones that really stands out is Andrew Hedrick with a Origin Form Dialga V-Star going 9-0 in day 1, no less. So exceptional stuff to see. I think this has sort of come on from Orlando, where we saw a decent placement, and the list has been slightly adapted, and I think there are some big changes going on with Andrew's list in a moment that we'll look at. So I think sort of forget about what you thought you knew about Dialga and look towards this new list, this new consistency engine around it, to be a lot more objective about the archetype. The strengths are obvious. We know that taking 2 turns is one of the strongest things you can do in the TCG, because your opponent can't react to what you're doing. It gives you a lot of great prize race capabilities, a great amount of like board control capabilities as well, being able to select 2 Pokemon to knock out whilst your opponent is sort of scrambling for stuff to do and actually just has to pass into you. And you have big one-hit KO potential as well with that Metal Blast if you get enough Metal Makers committed to one Pokemon. So we've always known the strengths of Dialga, and we've always just kind of shrugged at the list that we've seen up until this point. But I think when we look at the list in a moment from Andrew, really impressive stuff to have stripped the list back and changed what was conventionally thought as the best way to play the deck, brought something new to the table, and yeah, has really impressed with the build that he's made. Then the other list, we have Dean Nizam, again, very like veteran player, has played in a bunch of formats to a very high standard, and Dean's playing a Lost Zone variant. It just so happens to be Roaring Moon. It's the classic stuff of like Moon Hands. It's like the Paradox stuff. You've got the Hooper EX in there, the fighting guy, which I imagine randomly helps in the Dialga matchup as well, which is kind of interesting. So yeah, there's that sort of smorgasbord Lost Zone box. Then we have Grant Manley, again, very, very strong pilot. Will play anything that the spreadsheet tells him with that great testing group with Azul, with Caleb, of course. So this time playing the Pidgeot Control archetype. I think this is based on All Out Blitzel's playtesting that he's been doing a bunch of live streams on YouTube, where he's playing in online tournaments a bunch and has been perfecting a Control Pidgeot list, where it has all sorts of wacky Pokemon like Clorf and Wigglytuff, which we'll look into in a bit more detail in a moment. But taking that list as like a best metagame placement is exactly where you see Grant making it into that top 8. Then Ian Robb, also just very powerful player, where you can see him going deep into all sorts of tournaments with, once again, the deck that he feels is right for the tournament, not necessarily known for just playing one archetype, and in this case is sticking true to Charizard, but did make a couple of really big calls, which I think allowed him to not only progress through day 1 to day 2 very effectively, but especially in a field with chien-pao, make his way into top 8 as well. And I think certainly his A-spec choice helped out immensely with that. So really fantastic to see such a stacked top cut, honestly. Phenomenal players, very well-known players. Not the first time you'll see them in top cups and not the last either. So amazingly stacked tournaments with an interesting spread of decks. I don't think many people had on their bingo card that Dialga would go 9-0 and make it into top 8, but also just the waves of chien-pao doing all that well. Before I do jump into that, just to talk about the Lost Zone thing, you can see here that there was 18 Lost Zone box decks, as I said, slotting it between Arctina and Gardevoir on that sort of day 2 graphic. But also you'll see that Arceus was actually much closer to chien-pao in the overall stats, where you combine the Arctinas with the sort of more controlling archetypes that we've seen. Makani, the highest placing one, where it's a slight adaptation, I think, of the Sao Paulo list. Where you've got the Rad, Zard, and just a thick bit barrel, and then like the controlling cards. I know that's also what Scarlet and Olive were playing as well, which is, I think, the exact 60 from the previous week. Let's have a look. Yeah, it was the Sao Paulo list that we saw from Marco getting top 16. So combining Arceus, it's doing well. It's still a consistent performer. It still has decent times into Charizard and can handle the other decks in format as well with a combination of Destruction and all this other stuff. So yeah, let's move into the deck lists. We have Andrew with, like I said, a really interesting build of Dialga V-Star, where instead of playing the sort of traditional Arven Evo build, it's taken out those clunky supporters and just gone, let's just play the good cards and play 4 Research, 4 Iono, and a couple Pokegear in here to supplement that, and say, sure, maybe I'm getting slower Metangs on board, but I'm at least establishing a board every single game. I have deeper digs into the deck, so I can make sure that I'm finding my next Dialga V, my next V-Star, and just flowing through the game a lot more reasonably, whereas an Arven build, it's pretty much all in on me go second, me get double Metang, allow these 2 Metangs to like hard carry the game, and hope that just from the random draws of Greninja and a couple here and there from Mew EX are enough to supplement you throughout the game, and just really hoping that Metang filters the deck of the bad draws, so then you're drawing into your items a little bit more effectively. But that's not that secure, and I think even though you're sacrificing a little bit of speed in terms of your Metang development, I think your trade-off is that you're generally just playing the game more often because you're able to Iono to 6 and Research to 7 throughout the game just much more consistently. And this allows the Dialga to play a slightly different game plan. I think you're essentially trying to time your Star Chronos to a situation where either you can completely dominate someone's board position by taking out 2 Pokemon back-to-back via like Prime Catcher into Boss's Orders or vice versa, or you go down the alternate route of just like delaying this Star Chronos to a point where you can checkmate and take like 3 or 4 prizes to close out the game, where you can like Chronos into Metal Blast to finish stuff off as well. So it really allows you to play this slower game plan, which then also in turn helps you around Iono. Of course, there are situations where if your opponent has that weaker start, you can just immediately start Chronos and start punishing them and just race those prizes before they're getting developed. So if you do have those Metang high rolls, that's great. That's going to allow you to really pop off at them and punish them like no other deck really. But I think with this less guaranteed amount of Metangs early on in the game, just trying to time that Chronos is kind of the biggest play of the deck to bear in mind. Also bearing in mind that genome hacking is certainly a play online too, especially because you're going to try and use that Zamazenta to skew the prize race as and when, because it's certainly a big threat in its own right. Even if people are targeting like bench Dialga V, sometimes that just allows you to keep throwing the Zamazenta up at people, similar to like a Radzard almost, where you're trying to force that single prize in a lot of situations. And when you're doing that against Charizard, it then can allow the Mew EX to be a late game sweep as well. Genome hacking not only good for Charizard, but can be great, you know, copying opposing Greninjas and whatnot for surprise multi-prize turns. So it's not just a like engine Pokemon. The Dialga deck is actually very versatile, and I was very surprised. I was basically blinking at the fact that there was a Dialga going 9-0 because all of my testing has been with an Arven Evo build, which I thought basically couldn't draw cards, and if your opening 7 was bad, you're just done for. Whereas I think now playing a stable 8 great draw supporters plus poker gears, and then just maxing out counts of the good mandatory cards is like such a great way to build this deck. I think it was actually Drew Kennett who initially sort of created this build where you're Arvenless and playing better draw supporters, and I think Andrew has adapted that build into this week and had great results with it. I think a handful of other players piloted similar builds as well, so yeah, great results from Andrew there, and I think it was a really smart way to adapt the Dialga to capitalize on its strengths and allow yourself just to learn more within the deck, like once it plays the game more, how you can capitalize on it, which is kind of interesting. We then have Grant, as well as like everyone else's most successful chien-pao list. You can see so many results behind this, which is absolutely insane. Grant actually played the same list in Orlando by the looks of things, as did Reagan, who got top 4, so no reason to change the list whatsoever. So again, not too much to say here. It feels like the ratios are correct with the list. You've got all the mandatory inclusions, and you've got the Cypher Maniac trying to cherry pick the right cards at the right time. Feels like the 70 hit point Frigi is like important enough to keep in the deck list with enough Lost Zone decks around. So yeah, seems pretty powerful that chien-pao is doing well, and it looks like some of the best Chen mains are having the best placements with the exact same 60, which is always a good sign. Let's jump around and look at some more chien-pao just to see some slightly different builds. Let's see what Nick Moffat played that was an adaptation. I think this list is just playing no cancelling clone, so making that cut. It lets you have less power spikes, I suppose, but it comes off quite rarely regardless. So just dropping that seems like a fine choice, to be honest with you. We have Eddie's list, again, not like anyone else's. I'm trying to see the crucial differences here. I think it just plays 3 stop in favour of another card here, possibly just the rod, perhaps. Or one of the balls, or 4th candy, perhaps. I don't know if you need Silene and quad candy. That sounds like a lot, but yeah. Then we have Andrew's list, same as Kieran's top 32 lists as well. Don't know if that's a coincidence, but yeah, once again, dropping the cancelling clone. I think that is just one of those, almost like a win more card. There's times when you power spike the absolute stones and just get it off, and it feels like an amazing card, but there's a lot of times it clogs up the barrel hands, so I understand dropping it. This list finally rounding out that top 8 is choosing to play the clone though, but I think that's one of the like only debates left within chien-pao. To play cologne or not to play cologne seems like the last question remaining, which is pretty interesting overall. Moving on to Grant, who got a top 4 placement with this Pidgeot control list. Once again, sorry, there was a lot of players also piloting this, so the whole crew, Ryan, Caleb, Azul, all playing the same 60. And this is absolutely wild. There's so many random attacking options coming into this list, where you have the very chunky Wigglytuff that has the additional 100 hit points on it when it has a special energy attached. With the Mist and the double turbos in here, you can combine this with Hero's Cape quite nicely to be an absolute behemoth and be very difficult to get through. The Friend Tackle isn't like immense damage, but because you're so huge, it's going to be serviceable at times, so that can be useful, or just having it as a punching bag to be using that Sharon's Care on is certainly quite reasonable. There's also the Clawth, which is another like fantastic punching bag Pokemon, where if it's damaged by an attack, you discard energy from the attacking Pokemon. Certainly a frustrating Pokemon for your opponent to get through when you have such a huge amount of hit points to eat through, that any like low damage output deck is going to be in trouble. And obviously Charizards and such, you can try and make life difficult for them with this big Clawth Cape combination. So yeah, pretty scary times there. Interesting to see it's got the Cleffa in here for the grasping draw. We've seen this go into so many decks now. You have the one Poffin to try and find this, I suppose, because you're already looking for Pidgeys. This is also like a good pickup, so you can just get into this Pokemon. I feel like there aren't many ways to like retreat into it. I suppose you are playing such a high Arven that you can try and like rescue into it, but are there that many 1 retreat cost Pokemon? Actually, looking at it now, there probably are just enough 1 retreaters to get that early Cleffer, because you're only playing that one Snorlax. Yeah, maybe that's just a decent strat to get the Cleffer going. You don't necessarily have to commit Rotom to the board, which is quite a cool thing to have when you're up against archetypes that you know have a number of outs to your like trapping plays and this, that, and the other. You don't want to give higher damage output decks the chance to just like capitalize on Rotoms and Pidgeots and stuff like that around the board. So rather than like using it, then having to be forced to use Penny as a supporter for a turn, instead going for like a Cleffer route could be pretty reasonable in a lot of spots as well. So that's a really cool one to think about, and obviously it's a pivot in the deck as well, which like complements Radzard. So this can be like on the board late game, so even if Pidgeot's taken out, you know you can go Cleffer and then still make something of your turn. So that seems like a pretty nice inclusion. Honestly, I think to get the best sort of takes on this deck list, Blitzel is probably the best person to look out for. I'll try and remember to link their channel in the description, because they've been doing so much hard work recently. I think they're definitely worth shouting out and watching their content, because they play the game like so much right now. So because they become like a specialist in certain decks, I think their opinions will be really much more important than mine, which will be like loosely based on control, even though I've only played like a handful of games with Pidgeot control myself. So let's end things off with the final list, which is Ian's Charizard list. And it's not just the bog straightforward 60, because there are some pretty big inclusions here where you're really having a big change up of the tool counts. Sometimes, well, for the most part, the A-spec of choice is going to be that Prime Catcher, so you're typically seeing like Defiance Band in here, but Ian's gone for the maximum belts. Basically what we all thought would be in Charizard to begin with is now made it into the deck list. This certainly helps the chien-pao matchup, so it may be just the tipping points for the amount of chien-pao we're seeing as certainly the second most popular deck going into tournaments that Max Belt helps out in that regard, because it allows the Charizard player to be the proactive one, which essentially you can't be in most situations, because the chien-pao can use Iron Hands if you're trying to keep a one prize board, or they can try and get that cheesy Greninja play off, or of course if you are the one evolving up first, taking one prize or just hitting into a chien-pao, it just feels terrible, right? Because they can take the first two on you. So having a maximum belt allows the Charizard player to be a little bit more proactive, to really force the chien-pao to have that better hands to actually make that Iron Hands happen, which isn't like all that consistent, as they're also trying to scrabble for Irida grabbing like candy pieces very often. It means that they can't go grab things like Vessel for Lightning Energy plus Iron Hands search and stuff like that. So having that maximum belt allows you to capitalize that little bit more onto the power players, which I think is important. And also having the choice belt in here, I suppose you don't need Defiance so much when you have the max belt for mirror match situations to be your mod. So it's almost like a throwback list to like pre-EUIC, but it does still have those Taunt elements of the Bib and the Cleffer, just cleaning up that support count that little bit more, having the double counter catcher. These are all counts that we like sort of expected when we were playing max belt builds originally. So it's like a great hybrid mash of like changing the tools to deal with the anti-Charizard meta, whilst also having the engine that Tord sort of brought us and is so well established as being like such a great engine. And Ian is a great and very clever deck builder, and also went really far in the tournament, so props to them. Some of the other like highlights, did we even look at, maybe I missed Dean's Lost Box actually. I should talk about Dean's Lost Box. It's actually a very standard and nothing surprising Lost Box, to be honest with you, where it's got the same smorgasbord that we've expected. So there's nothing too much to shout out about their list, but cool to see it nonetheless, making it into that top 8. No like huge innovation though, just going with fairly standard counts. I think the quad rod gate thing has been around for like a long time. Fitting in the vacuum is fine, but yeah, nothing like wild about that list whatsoever. There were some other lost boxes in that top 16, so again, like, don't be fooled by the graphic. It actually had like a very good tournament with top 4 placement as well as a number of top 16 placements. I've already slightly mentioned Makani's list, but yeah, cool to see that the like grabber quad arc thing is doing okay still. That's certainly a cool archetype that I'm going to put more time into myself as someone who likes playing arc in my free time. Just in general, the highest place in Gardevoir, interesting to see as well. Just keep an eye on it, where it's got the Clef key in here as well as the Flutter. Typically you just see like Flutter. Sometimes you still see that Clef key as well. Playing the triple CC. Nothing too wild about this list either, to be honest with you, but just cool to see that Gardevoir is still in that mix. It's kind of been in that touching distance a number of times now and just falling a little bit short. Once again, we're seeing the Espathra making it into that top 32. A number of other players making it into top 32 with Dialga as well, so it wasn't just a one-hit wonder. There's a handful of other pilots also attempting this as well, which is pretty surprising to see. There's also the Raging Bolt making it into top 64. Is this the highest Raging Bolt we've seen so far? Props to them, to be honest with you. It's pretty much the expected 60, I think, for the list. Quite dense on those items, leaning into the Pokestops. I think also just the amount of chien-pao around giving you Pokestop is probably quite beneficial right now, which is cool. Having that one hit KO potential is still something you can't really sniff at. 240 hit points also on Raging Bolt is actually like pretty massive. There are great elements to that archetype. I just feel like it's slightly less consistent than some of the other decks that we have in format. Although to be fair, some of our top decks in format are fairly inconsistent, which is like a bad thing I think for the format. But if you can find something that you can jam with and gel with, I guess that's fine. Some Roaring Moons in the top 64 as well, but far worse than the last few weeks, which is surprising actually. With the amount of chien-pao that rose to the top, I'm surprised there wasn't just one or two like ancient boxes kind of snuck in there as well, because that's one of the best matchups into POW actually. So I wonder if there'll be a knee-jerk going into the next couple of weeks if ancient box becomes a better play because it's very, very solid into chien-pao. That might be a pretty interesting thing to follow. Let's go on to the Buenos Aires special event then. Like I said, it's a much smaller event, but still worth noting because this sort of back end of tournaments is all of the LATAM events essentially, so everyone's going to be racing for that invite now, which is pretty cool to see. And I think they have a real cluster of tournaments going on over the next couple of weeks as well, so their meta game is going to be evolving quite quickly week to week. But it was a Charizard that was able to take the win. And the list is pretty straightforward. That Mist Energy becoming slightly more common, I think, recently because there's that respect for Devo. This one's not going crazy on the Devo, just the one copy and the one area. It does have Pal Pad in here as well, so not like overcommitting to any one thing. Just having those few flexible options to keep your opponent on their toes is kind of interesting. Despite the Ancient Box sort of flop in the US, it got second place here, and that's a cool thing to see. Again, as we know, because you have to play 30 ancient cards, your ratios can't go too far from the list that we've seen in the past. So sticking pretty true with that. It's the same list that we saw. Okay, so they also played in Sao Paulo a couple of weeks ago to a decent placement as well, which is cool to see. We don't quite have all the lists, but we do have a couple more Charizards in here as well, where we see nothing too spectacular here. When I say nothing too spectacular, I mostly mean like any new innovation. There's nothing wrong with the lists at all, just being the ones that we know are tried and trusted, obviously. A couple of interesting things like the Vitality Band popping up, but nothing too like groundbreaking. These are all very solid, safe lists that we've seen so far. Future Hands making it into a top 8. We haven't seen that for a little while. chien-pao also made it into the top 8 in this tournament. And also Gardevoir made it into top 8, which is something we haven't seen. Oh, wow. Okay, so this one's a little bit more wild. We have the 1-1 Espathra EX coming into the deck list. Obviously, it's a grass type. It has one hit KO potential into Zard, and you can try and burst that into play because you can embrace onto Flittle before evolving up a few times, which is kind of cool. You could even do like a Bravery Charm onto the Flittle, and then like as you evolve, even though the Bravery Charm's like going off, you're gaining those hit points with the Espathra anyway, so you can do some cheeky stuff there to one-hit like a number of things, and also I suppose it can be like a frustrating ability to deal with for some basic attacking decks, like a random Future Box or something that pops up. So I don't know how consistent this is into the deck list that's also like quite tight for space, but dropping things like the luxury third counter catcher and stuff isn't like the worst thing anyway. I suppose you're just rededicating like power cards into different power cards. So that's something that might be worth exploring as well. But yeah, pretty interesting results around the board. I don't know how we knee-jerk react to like chien-pao being this dominant. I don't know if it was like a 1 week meta where it just seemed like there's that much Charizard, although I still expect there to be a huge amount of Charizard anyway. Possibly it was just like very strong pilots piloted chien-pao in like the right format. But now with chien-pao like more on the radar, I suppose, Mirror matches certainly become a concern, because I don't know if anyone actually wants to play a Manaphy. And even if they do, like, sometimes just going first is better anyway. So I don't know how good that even is. And also, like, chien-pao's not the highest consistency deck, even if you are sequencing it perfectly. So it feels weird for it to be, like, displacing Charizard. I think, like I said earlier, it's mostly just still Charizard's the best and just, like, had a rough tournament. I feel like Ian, with his Max Belt innovation, or I guess the return of Max Belt, it's not really an innovation, but selecting the metagame for Max Belt correctly is an also really interesting take to bring into the next few tournaments, because I think it could help carry you into one of your, like, closer matchups. And I think the data pre-EUIC probably favoured Charizard a lot more into chien-pao than when we went towards the Prime Catcher builds that we've seen post-EUIC. So that's a really smart pickup in how you can adapt that matchup with just one card change that doesn't really affect the deck too much. So that'll be an interesting back and forth. Arc build still going strong, Lost Zone going strong, Gardevoir still having very respectable tournament results overall. Those are really the big talking points apart from Dialga. And I wonder if just in a week people have been able to, like, source the Dialgas, learn the deck well enough to pilot it, and it's going to be a complete turnaround, and Dialga might make it onto a day one graphic, which would be absolutely insane, by the way. But genuinely, like I said, the deck list shift in mentality was really cool to see. And I think it was... Let's have a look when it actually was. I'm pretty sure it was Drew from Orlando. Did he play... Okay, yeah, so he just played one Arven, right? So that's where the shift in mentality, I believe, started from, if I'm correct. Because this is definitely a shift in how to play Dialga. Because before that tournament, really, we didn't have many impressive results. I think Drew's played it for a couple of tournaments, so has been tweaking it as he went. But it's cool to see that, like, it's had pretty low placements. Then suddenly, when a new list is, like... pounced on, they have much just like higher placements and a few more consistent placements. So let me know your thoughts on Dialga as well. Like, is this new engine making it just so much better, and we've just underrepresented it because we were playing it with Arven, assuming that was the best way to play it, just based off like Japanese metagame and stuff? Or was it just a good tournament for it? And again, Hedrick's a fantastic pilot, so made the most of a pretty average deck. I'll hear your thoughts down below, and I'll see you tomorrow for another one. Cheers.